The last topic for this chapter is acid-base balance. Now we've kind of touched on this acid-base balance in both chapters 23 and 26 when we talk about how both the respiratory system and urinary system are known to adjust or help maintain acid-base balance. Now, quick review, acid-base balance is all surrounding the concentration or the regulation or controlling of the concentration of hydrogen ions in our body fluids. Now, hydrogen ions are extremely dangerous and extremely reactive, so we need to maintain them within very minute levels, as you saw previously. Hydrogen ion concentrations are particularly dangerous when it comes to disrupting protein function. And since the majority of our bodily activities involve proteins, hydrogen ion concentration needs to be maintained within very finite levels. In particular, we have 7.35 to 7.45 is our goal. Now, in general, being too acidic and being too alkaline are both a possibility, but since human diets tend to be high on the acidic side of things, we tend to have more of an issue with keeping our body from becoming too acidic than we do from becoming too alkaline. Now, in order to maintain this very finite range, we have three mechanisms available to help us. We have buffer systems, we have the control of carbon dioxide levels in our blood, which is referred to as respiratory compensation, and we have kidney excretion of hydrogen ions, and as you saw, reabsorption of bicarbonate through the urinary system. So let's take first a look at buffer systems. Buffer systems are used to minimize rapid, drastic changes in pH. Now, they do not prevent it, but they do minimize it. The idea here is buffers like to convert strong acids and or bases into weaker ones. So the idea here is you may still be adding an acid to your solution, but it's a weak one, so it's not going to change the pH very much. Buffers are very important because they are already on site and immediate. They work extremely quickly in order to stabilize the pH in the short term. Problem is, they are extremely limited and temporary. Okay. Since we don't have a never-ending supply of buffers, we can run out, and not only that, you may be adding a weaker acid, but you're still adding an acid to a solution, so that's why we say these are temporary. Now, in our body, we have three primary buffer systems that we employ. Basically, any protein can act as a buffer in our body. We have the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer, and then finally the phosphate buffer. Let's take a look first at your protein buffer. Proteins are the most abundant buffer in our body since we have proteins everywhere. Problem is, we don't want to rely on them too heavily since once a protein starts buffering, its original function tends to be compromised. So we don't want to rely too heavily on protein buffers because they no longer will be able to do their original job. Now, proteins have a variety of functional groups, but the two that are important in their buffering capacity is the carboxyl group, which is a COOH, and the amino group, which is the NH2. Now, the carboxyl group helps buffer alkaline solutions because what it likes to do is pop off a hydrogen ion. And when you add hydrogen ions to a solution, it makes it more acidic, which helps if you start out alkaline. The amino group, on the other hand, likes to pick up hydrogen ions, becoming NH3. This, of course, helps us if we're acidic, because once we bind that hydrogen ion to our amino group, it's no longer free, and it's not causing any problems anymore. Now, the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system is something we've already seen as we discussed it in the cardiovascular, or in the respiratory system, excuse me. Carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer functions in both extracellular and intracellular fluid, and it is created when carbon dioxide combines with water, as you saw previously. Now what we end up seeing is this reaction shifts to the left or to the right depending on whether you are acidic or alkaline. If you are acidic, the hydrogen ions jump onto our bicarbonate and the reaction goes in this direction. If you are alkaline, okay, the hydrogen ions pop off of our carbonic acid and the reaction goes in this direction. Okay. Now this is great in most bodily fluids. Problem is, if the reason you're at a pH imbalance is due to the respiratory system, then this guy cannot help you, since carbonic acid levels in the blood are directly linked to carbon dioxide levels in the blood, which of course would be abnormal if you had a respiratory problem. Finally, we have the phosphate buffer system. The phosphate buffer system is a very important intracellular buffer, and it fluctuates between a monohydrogen and a dihydrogen phosphate. I don't know why that's here. This should be, let me pause this and correct it so you're not confused. That looks a little better. So this is our dihydrogen phosphate, this is our monohydrogen phosphate. Now the monohydrogen phosphate likes to pick up hydrogen ions, shifting the whole reaction in this direction, which helps if we are too acidic. Switching it around, this guy likes to pop off hydrogen ions, which helps us if we are too alkaline, shifting the reaction in this direction. Now, all of this is great. The problem is, these are all temporary fixes. We don't have a never-ending supply of carbonic acid, nor do we have a never-ending supply of bicarbonate, depending on what situation we're trying to fix. But as we're seeing, or as we saw back in the respiratory system, the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system, which is this portion of the reaction here, can actually be linked to a permanent fix through the exhalation of carbon dioxide. Now, we have two scenarios here. If we are too acidic, we can shift the whole reaction in this direction. And in this case, we end up creating more CO2, which we get rid of the excess via hyperventilation. Now we saw this in chapter 23, so it should be review. If, on the other hand, we are too alkaline, we're going to shift the reaction in that direction. In order to do this, we need to keep all of our CO2. And we do this via hypoventilation. Now, the use of the respiratory system to regulate pH can only get you so far, since remember, at the same time we may be changing our breathing rate to adjust CO2 levels in the blood, we're also affecting oxygen levels in the blood. And not only that, you can only hypoventilate or hyperventilate so much. So although this is very quick, second only to buffers in trying to fix acid-base disturbances, it is limited. Okay, what's more robust but maybe slower acting is the excretion of hydrogen ions from your kidneys. Very quickly though, back to this diagram. So here we see how a increase in hydrogen ion concentration or a decrease in pH is detected by the chemoreceptors in the central chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata, which stimulate the dorsal respiratory group to increase and contract more frequently, leading to hyperventilation, expelling the excess carbon dioxide, and as a result, decreasing the amount of acid in our blood. This is again a review from earlier in chapter 23. Now, remember, your kidneys have the ability to adjust CO2 in two ways, pH in two ways. If you are too acidic, these guys will increase H plus excretion and increase bicarbonate reabsorption. If you are too alkaline, they will of course do the opposite by decreasing both H plus excretion and bicarbonate reabsorption. Now remember, this only gets you so far. If you are extremely alkaline, you will actually switch and begin to reabsorb hydrogen ions and excrete bicarbonate. This, of course, specific to your intercalated cells. So here we see the different mechanisms associated with a review of the different mechanisms associated with acid-base balance. So let's go ahead and talk about how these are. Actually, I have a few questions here before we get into the specifics of acid-base imbalances. So take a second. Which of the following buffers an acidic environment? Okay, well, if you're buffering an acidic environment, you got to be able to pick up hydrogen ions, and that will be B and C. Sorry, forgot to put my little double star up here to signify this as multiple potential answers. The respiratory system compensates for acidosis by hypoventilation. Well, in order to get an idea about how the respiratory system compensates, you have to remember that in our body, CO2 equals an acid. Well, then ask yourself, what does hypoventilation do? Well, hypoventilation causes us to keep our CO2, and if we keep our CO2, we become more acidic, and would becoming more acidic help us if we are already acidic? Hopefully you're thinking no, so the answer is false. Okay, so now let's talk specifically about some acid-base disturbances and acid-base imbalances. So what happens here is anytime you have a pH below 7.35, you're said to be in acidosis, and anytime you have a pH above 7.45, you're said to be in alkalosis. Now, the primary symptom or complication with acidosis is actually a depression of the CNS, leading to, in extreme circumstances, coma and eventually death. Vice versa, alkalosis will actually cause overexcitation, seizures, and again, eventually death. Now, not only is the normal range very narrow, but your dead range is also pretty narrow because it's 6.8 to 8. If you're outside of this range, you are dead. So you got to keep this relatively tightly controlled, as you know, it becomes extremely dangerous and deadly very, very quickly. Now, ideally, the second you get outside this normal range, your body tries to fix it. And the buffers are already working. But remember, the buffers aren't actually fixing anything. All they're doing is hiding it away. The actual fixing is referred to as compensation, and it is accomplished by the respiratory system and the renal. Of course, the respiratory system adjusts breathing rates, when the urinary system adjusts the excretion, in general, the excretion of hydrogen ions and the reabsorption. of bicarb. Okay. Now, in general, there are two types or two causes to your acid-base imbalances. You have respiratory acidosis and alkalosis and metabolic acidosis and alkalosis. Now, anytime the respiratory system is broken, that tends to lead to abnormal levels of CO2 in the blood. And when those levels of CO2 in the blood are abnormal, your acid-base disturbance is referred to as respiratory in nature. If it's not CO2 and it's something else, then it's metabolic in nature. So let's go ahead and take a look at each of these imbalances, starting first with respiratory acidosis. Respiratory acidosis results when CO2 levels in the blood are above 45 millimeters of mercury. Okay, this results from the abnormal, a decrease in your breathing rate, which causes CO2 to accumulate in the blood. This can also result from decrease in gas exchange. Let's say you have emphysema or pulmonary edema, or things that cause you to difficulty in breathing or taking a deep breath, and the gases end up accumulating in your blood. Now, since the respiratory system is broken, respiratory compensation can't be used, but renal compensation can, and again, we increase H+ excretion and we increase bicarbonate reabsorption. Now, the treatment for acidosis is, for any type of acidosis, is pretty straightforward, because all you have to do is administer IV bicarbonate. But in this case, remember, with all of these acid-base disturbances, you need to fix the original cause, otherwise you'll just keep falling right back into it. If you still have emphysema and you haven't fixed the original problem, then you're just going to keep ending up in acidosis again. Flip that around, we have respiratory alkalosis, where you don't have enough CO2 in the blood. It is too low, below 35 millimeters of mercury. In this case, you're losing too much CO2, and this is typically done by hyperventilating. Now, breathing too quickly due to anxiety attack or altitude sickness will all lead to the loss of too much CO2. Excuse me. Again, renal compensation in this case is going to decrease hydrogen ion secretion, decrease bicarbonate reabsorption, and switch if extreme. Now, if the problem is anxiety, you're often directed to breathe into a paper bag. The reason why this works is you're rebreathing your own air, which has a higher CO2 level, making CO2 less likely to leave the blood in that case. Excuse me. Metabolic acidosis, on the other hand, results from arterial blood's HCO3 levels being too low. Now, you might wonder why we've gone from CO2 to bicarbonate. Well, remember, bicarbonate in the blood is our buffer. If you are becoming acidic, all of your bicarbonate is being used to buffer, which means it's picking up hydrogen ions, and actual bicarb levels themselves then are dropping. So as bicarb serves as the buffer, the levels in the blood will drop, and this is when we see a metabolic acidosis occurring, again when levels are below 22 milliequivalents. So anything that makes your blood acidic will lead, other than the respiratory system, will lead to metabolic acidosis. The consumption of acidic drugs can lead to metabolic acidosis. Extreme diarrhea can lead to metabolic acidosis as you are losing excessive amounts of bicarbonate in your watery feces. Accumulation of acids, say from excessive lipid metabolism or excessive anaerobic metabolism. Consumption of acidic drugs like aspirin, I think I already mentioned that. Finally, kidney failure, as your kidneys lose the ability to excrete hydrogen ions when they begin to fail. Now, since it's metabolic in nature, we can now use both respiratory and renal compensation. Respiratory compensation occurs via hyperventilation, because if you're too acidic, you want to get rid of acid, which means you want to get rid of your CO2. Renal compensation increases excretion of hydrogen ion, increases bicarbonate. Again, with acidosis, it's a pretty easy medical treatment through the administration of IV bicarb. But remember, unless you fix the original problem, you'll just keep becoming acidic again, so it's always very important to correct the cause. Last but not least, we have metabolic alkalosis. Metabolic alkalosis, in this case, is excessive bicarbonate levels above 26 milliequivalents. Anything that causes you to accumulate, either lose acid or accumulate bicarbonate, will lead to metabolic alkalosis. And this would include vomiting and gastric suctioning as you are excreting or losing excess acid. Diuretics can lead to acidosis as you're peeing out excess acid. And of course, the intake of excessive intake of alkaline drugs. Well, in this case, if you're alkaline, you want to keep all of your acid, which means you want to keep your CO2 via hypoventilation. And of course, you decrease hydrogen ion secretion, decrease bicarbonate reabsorption, and switch if extreme. Since many of the metabolic alkalosis causes accompany dehydration, in many cases your treatment is fluid and electrolyte therapy, but the most important, of course, is to correct the cause. Now, what we've done thus far is talked a lot about all of these imbalances, and we've talked about these values. But what I want to do is kind of put it into perspective here. And this is something many of you will be doing in lab, talking about these imbalances and how to diagnose them. So I just want to make a little chart for you to go over this. Up here at the top, I'm writing your normal values. Okay, and what we're doing down here is looking at which values are abnormal for these different situations. Now, this first chart is going to go over uncompensated, which means our body has not tried to fix it. If our body has not tried to fix it, then only two of these three values are going to be abnormal. pH, of course, and then whichever one is causing the problem, PCO2 or bicarbonate. Now, since the first two are respiratory in nature, we know CO2 is what's causing the problem, so bicarb will all be normal. And over here with these two, metabolic is the cause, so we'll know that CO2 will be normal. Now, from here, what we do is we simply fill in our chart. Since we're in acidosis, we know the pH is below 7.35. Now, since we know CO2 in our body is an acid and we're in acidosis, then our PCO2 levels has to be above 45. Coming down here, again, we're in the respiratory system and we're alkaline, so the pH in this case has to be above 7.45. And since CO2 is an acid and we're alkaline, that means our levels have to be below 35 millimeters of mercury. Now, acidosis, this hasn't changed, so we're still below 7.35. The question is, what is causing it? Well, in this case, it's acidosis. Well, CO2 was an acid, but remember, bicarb in our body equals base or alkaline. So if we're acidic, that means we don't have enough base, so we are below 22 milliequivalents per liter. Alkalosis here, so we're now above 7.45. And again, alkaline, we're basic. Well, bicarb is a base, that must mean we have too much, so we're above 26 milliequivalents per liter. Here's the thing, though, with this chart. All of this is uncompensated, meaning your body has not tried to fix it yet. Here's the thing. How likely would you be to drop below 7.35 and to stay uncompensated? Not very, right? Because the second you drop below 7.35, your body is going to try to fix it. Well, the second your body tries to fix it, we're going to start adjusting the bicarb levels in the blood. So now all of a sudden all three values are going to be abnormal, but one of them is going to be the cause and one of them is going to be the fix. So let's take a look what happens when we have partially compensated acidosis and alkalosis. Let's go ahead and rewrite our normal values up here. Okay, well, let's take a second first and write in our values here for acidosis. So again, we're acidic, so we are going to be below 7.35. Now we remember the respiratory system is going to be CO2 levels are going to be abnormal. And since CO2 equals acid, then we know that we're going to have high levels. So we're going to be above 45 millimeters of mercury. Now remember, the second you become acidic, how does the urinary system help fix that? Well, remember, it's going to increase hydrogen ion excretion, increase bicarbonate reabsorption. Well, if it's increasing bicarbonate reabsorption, we're going to be above 26 milliequivalents per liter. Now the question becomes, which one of these is causing the problem? Which one of these is fixing the problem? Well, in order to determine that, what we want to do is write in each of these boxes what these values mean. Well, below 7.35, that equals acid. Above 45, that equals acid. Above 26, that equals base. Well, these two are the matching ones, so that means this one is the cause, and this one is the fix. Over here with alkalosis, again, above 7.45. It's respiratory, and so that means we are below 35 milliequivalents, millimeters of mercury, excuse me. And remember, if you're alkaline, the kidneys are going to decrease hydrogen ion excretion and decrease bicarbonate reabsorption. And as they decrease that reabsorption, our bicarb values are going to drop as we start peeing them out. So we're going to be below 22 milliequivalents per liter. Again, doing what we just did, well, this says alkaline. This says alkaline. But this number says acidic. Well, that means these two are matching, so this one equals the cause, whereas this one is the fix. Coming over to another acidosis, but in this case metabolic, we have 7.35. Again, we're above that. Well, if this is the case, and it's metabolic, we know that we don't have enough bicarbonate, so we are below 22 milliequivalents per liter. But remember, the second you become acidic, you begin to hyperventilate, which causes your CO2 levels to drop, so you're going to be below 35 millimeters of mercury. Well, writing this out, above 7.35 equals acid, below 35 equals base, and below 22 equals acid. So now we see these two are the links, so that means this one has to be the cause and this one has to be the fix, hence metabolic acidosis. Finally, we have metabolic alkalosis with 7.45 pH below 7. Excuse me, I'm sorry, it's below 7.35 and above 7.45. I apologize for that. Okay. It's metabolic in nature, so we know that we have extra bicarbonate in the blood. Now, the second you become alkaline, your respiratory system is going to try to keep all your CO2 and keep all of your acid, so your CO2 levels are going to start to rise above 45 millimeters of mercury. Well, at this point, again, we see that above 7.45 equals base, above 45 equals acid, and above 26 equals base. So again, we see that these two are the ones that are in the same direction, so that equals this one is the cause, and this one is the fix. Now all of these show partially compensated, which means the body has started to fix it, but it hasn't finished fixing it. If these were completely compensated, then our pH would be back to normal. But these two values, CO2 and bicarbonate, would still be abnormal. And that becomes a little more difficult to diagnose as far as which one caused it if we don't have the original pH to give us the cue. So let's finish up with some do you get it questions to figure out if you guys understand what's going on. Now, when we're doing things like this, what I like to do is write little notes next to each one of these in order to determine what's going on. So, 7.2, this one equals acid. PCO2 of 52, this would be high, which equals, as we just saw, acid. And a bicarb of 24, which equals normal. Now with this information, that tells us that it's acidic and it's because of the respiratory system, so respiratory acidosis would be our answer. Here we have one that's a little more difficult. Okay. In this case, we have 7.55, which equals alkaline. PCO2 of 48, which equals acidic. And a bicarb of 29, which equals alkaline. So what we'll end up seeing here is that the CO2 and the bicarbonate are what is matching. That means this guy is the cause, and we've started to fix it with the respiratory system. So that tells us this is metabolic alkalosis. Finally, which of the following imbalances would result from vomiting? Well, when you vomit, you lose acid. And if you're losing acid and it's not the respiratory system, that means you're going to be in metabolic alkalosis. Okay, that brings us to the end of our third lecture for Chapter 27. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me or come see me during my office hours. Other than that, I will see you back here for Chapter 24, which is the last lecture of the semester.